In 1700, Peter the Great decreed that from that day forward, all Russians, except for peasants and priests, would wear European clothing. This was one of the very first of his westernization reforms, and yet, despite its importance, no scholar had really undertaken to study how this transformation occurred. So I decided that I would do this. And in the process, I discovered that the Russians created their own domestic fashion industry, by which I mean that they trained a workforce to sew the new clothing. They also had to find ways of publicizing the new clothing, which meant primarily creating a fashion press and advertising. They also had to come up with ways of buying and selling the clothes, which meant in a lot of cases importing new retail techniques into Russia. This is all a fascinating and complicated story. Unfortunately, I cannot share all of that with you today. It's just too big and there's too much to say. But if you're interested, you could take a peek in my book, The Empire's New Clothes, and learn more about those specific topics. What I'm going to talk about today is another equally important part of the story, which is how did Russians learn to feel comfortable in their new clothing? And one of my commentators that I ran across in the mid-19th century, I thought put it best. Could a French corset stifle a Russian heart? So that is the question that I'm going to be trying to address today. Before I do so, though, I would like to say this, that the Russian Empire, even in 1700, had a vast number of ethnic groups within it, and each one had their own form of ethnic dress. And I quickly realized when I started this project that I could not possibly uh, discuss each ethnic group and do justice to their traditional clothing and the ways in which they tried to integrate themselves by adopting European dress. So if any of you are interested in those topics, please go ahead and undertake them. In my case, I chose to look specifically at Russian ethnic dress, um, and think of it, if you will, as a kind of case study for some of these other groups. And the real sort of the purpose of Peter's reform was to make Russians look Russian so that they could participate in European life and affairs. And that was the goal. So let me start now with some images of Russian traditional dress. So here we have two photographs of men wearing robes that were typical for male aristocrats in 17th century Moscow, or not just Moscow, but Muscovy. So let's start at the top. Notice that both men are wearing beards. This was a sign of piety on the part of Russian Orthodox men. And then please notice the robes that the men are wearing. And these are called kaftans. And if you start with the gentleman on the left, notice that his kaftan has this horizontal stripe on his clothing. Let me use my pointer here. So here they are. But then, so this is his outer kaftan. And then underneath he has another one, but this one has diagonal stripes to it, which adds visual interest to what it is that he's wearing. The gentleman on the right also is wearing a kaftan. In this case, it's buttoned and belted the way they were. And in this case, too, he has on this beautiful brocade. I don't know whether you can see it or not, but this must have been gorgeous because it has this very elaborate and dramatic design of flowers and leaves and that kind of thing. And it would have been done in reds and yellows and greens and oranges and all these very bright colors. So one of the distinctive markers of Russian traditional clothing is a sort of is the way in which they combine color and pattern to come up with these beautiful costumes. Now, in the case of female aristocrats, they wore gowns something like this. So if we look at the photograph on the left, this is my left, I don't know what it would be on your side. Um, this is a picture of Nicholas II's sister, Ksenia Alexandrovna. And here she is wearing this beautiful gown. And then the woman on the right, I don't know her name, but she too is wearing another version of Muscovite clothing. So once again, let's start at the top. Ksenia is wearing this beautiful headdress that is called a kokoshnik and was typical of both aristocratic and even peasant women wore kokoshniki. Notice how beautifully embroidered it is, and then it has pearls on it, and then she has this cap that covers her hair, and indeed her hair is completely covered in the back, and she has this string of pearls on for decoration. The woman on the right is wearing another form of headdress. In this case, it appears to model the medieval Russian military helmet that was worn by the army. But notice too that her hair is covered by this fabric. And this was typical for married women, not just in Russia, but everywhere else. Um, Hair was seen as a sign of modesty and sexuality. And so you are not modesty, but sexuality. And you would cover your hair once you got married, and it was only your husband who would see your hair after that. Now, if we look at the upper part of the gown, notice that both women are wearing these sort of beautiful mantles. These are a piece of clothing that the Russians adopted from Muscovy. And this was a moment in which, once again, you could have elaborate decoration, and particularly on the part of um, Grand Duchess Ksenia, she has on both pearls and embroidery and precious stones. These were really quite dramatic. Now, the gowns that both women are wearing are fairly simple, straightforward tunics. Obviously, they are made from beautiful fabrics, but the thing that is quite distinctive, particularly on the part of Ksenia Alexandrovna's outfit, are the sleeves. And these sleeves were typical both, again, for aristocratic dress, and even peasant women would wear these sleeves for special occasions. So notice that they go all the way down almost to the floor, and that the inner seam is open so that the woman can put her arms outside of the sleeve itself. Because, of course, the sleeves are completely decorative, and it would be impossible for a woman to do much of anything with wearing a sleeve like that. So the idea is that they represent a woman who doesn't really have to do any kind of work because she had servants to help her with this. The woman on the right is wearing more of a kimono style sleeve, but again, they're very, very long and represent sort of leisure time, a woman who does not work at domestic responsibilities. So this is what the upper class was wearing, and now we come to ordinary people. So the photograph on the left was taken of these two peasants after they had come in from the fields. And so if we start with their heads, we can see that the peasant not wearing the hat has a bowl cut. That was how peasant men cut their hair, and that once again they have the long beards. But the peasant on the right is wearing ordinary folk clothes or work clothes. His clothing is plain. It has no decoration. It's made from homespun linen and probably made by his wife or his daughters. and it's intended for work in the fields. The man sitting next to him has on a sheepskin coat, which was typical for peasants to wear in the winter. Now, notice here that this is a hand-me-down coat. Here we can see there's this rather large hole right over his knee. And because sheepskin coats were expensive and they were passed down from one generation to the next. Now, if we look at the other knee here, we can see that this man is wearing his trousers tucked into his boots, which was another sign of peasant dress. And of course, the coat itself is very dirty, once again suggesting that this is a hand-me-down. Now, over here on the right, we have a costume that would have been worn for special occasions on the part of male peasants. So if we look at the trousers, they're made of a fairly coarse woolen fabric, uh, not well tailored. I mean, they were tailored to sort of stay on, but no tailoring to them. And then they have the boots that they would be tucked, and the trousers would be tucked into. It's the shirt, which the Russians call a rubashka, that makes this a celebratory garment. So the rubashka would have been made from linen, but notice that it has this elaborate embroidery on it, and note where it's placed. So we have embroidery around the neck, the shoulders, the cuffs, and the hem. And this is embroidery, folk embroidery that has various symbols from Russian folklore and folk life. And the idea of having this embroidery in these particular places was that it was to prevent evil spirits from coming up underneath the shirt and attacking the body of the wearer. And the embroidery itself, even though this is a black and white photograph, would be done in reds and oranges and other bright colors. Now, this is what female peasants wore. So, like their male counterparts, they too are wearing linen shirts, but in this case, they come down to their knees. So they're more like a chemise, if you will, or a linen dress. But here too, note that just like the men, they have embroidery at the neck, the shoulders, the cuffs, and we can't see it, but on the hem of the garment. And over these chemises, if you will, Russian peasant women would either wear a skirt or this type of garment, which is called a sarafan, which is, by the way, a Persian word, which suggests the origins of the sarafan. Anyway, the thing to note here is the use of color and pattern that's very bright and attractive, sort of adding some color to this garment to make it rather more dramatic than it might be in just simple linen and cotton. And then to add to the drama, this shawl has been added. So lots of color, lots of pattern. Over here on the left in this photograph, we have an outfit that would have been worn for a festive occasion. So a baptism, a wedding, particular kinds of parties that would be held. And this was worn by a young non-married woman. So notice that this woman is wearing a skirt, a round skirt, in this window pane black and white pattern. And at the hem, she has this red and yellow sort of decorative element around the hem. And with this skirt, she has on this very brightly colored belt that she's wearing, so adding more drama to this skirt. Underneath the skirt, she has on one of these chemises, but we can tell that this one is one intended for a very festive occasion, because instead of having the folk embroidery, she has this attached to the top of the garment. And this is almost certainly gold thread embroidery, perhaps with some pearls, seed pearls or something like that. Then over the chemise, she has on this very distinctive garment. So it has two straps to it. And then this, not really sure quite what to call this, but a kind of apron or over blouse that is in a dark green, and then she has on lace and a cream colored border to this. So it has no practical purpose. It's intended to add drama to the dress that she has on, her outfit that she's wearing. And then we can see that the sleeves are also very dramatically colored and with this beautiful sort of orange embroidery, drawing the people's attention to the sleeves. And then the final drama of this outfit is this headdress that she has. And we can see from this that the young woman who would wear this would wear it with her hair exposed. Again, signifying that she's unmarried and perhaps hoping in such a beautiful gown as this or outfit as this that she might actually find a partner. So, in all of these pictures that I've shown you of Russian dress, I think there's something that I'd like to point out, which is that in all cases, whether they're aristocratic or peasant, the only flesh that's exposed is the face and the hands. Everything else is covered up, and in most cases is covered up in such a way that the body itself is not detectable. I mean, this is very heavy clothing that covers the body completely. And that is one of the features of European dress, which changes with Peter the Great. So on the left, we have a photograph of an effigy, an actual effigy of what we think Peter the Great looked like in person. This effigy used to be in the Hermitage Museum. I don't know if it's still there, but I actually saw this in person one of the times that I went to the Hermitage. But notice, unlike the heavy clothing that hid the body in Muscovy, now we have a suit that was tailored to Peter's body. And this is an actual set of clothes that Peter himself wore. Unlike the heavy robes and the kaftans of Muscovite clothing, now we have this beautiful silk, French silk garment with the tailor jacket and the camisole underneath, which was typical of the time, and of course his breeches that he's wearing. So even though there's no more flesh being revealed in this outfit than there would have been in Muscovite clothing, nevertheless, you have a sense of Peter's physique. And this would have been true for all the men who wore this style of clothing in the 18th century. The same is true, although we might not think so, of the gowns that women wore, aristocratic women wore. So the picture on the right shows a gown that was made for Elizaveta Petrovna, Peter's daughter, who was empress in the mid-18th century. So here we have a gown made of French sort of tangerine colored silk with beautiful gold and silk embroidery, just like men's dress over here. But in this case, a very full skirt, but nevertheless, the dramatic change was the emphasis in European fashion on a woman's upper body. So we have this very distinctive waist that is a part of this gown, and then the upper the upper body is covered with this tight-fitting French silk, and then you have the exposure of her neck and her upper chest. And even the sleeves only go to her elbow, and so her forearms would be revealed. So even though this seems probably really very covered, given our modern dress, nevertheless, for the 18th century, this was very radical and certainly very different from what women wore at court before Peter the Great's reforms. Okay, so what happens is this, as the court gets more comfortable in European clothing and wears nothing else really because that's the law of the land, as it were, some people in the government and even in high society are concerned that Russian aristocrats are losing their Russianness by not having clothing that represents their ethnic identity the way they did in the previous century. So what happens is you have a reformation, if you will, of Russian court dress. So this is what aristocrats would wear to the court. And this is what it looked like. So on the left, we have this uniform that was worn by certain aristocrats, depending on their station at the court. Notice that it's made completely in a Western European design and style. The only thing that makes it Russian is that the double-headed eagle has been embroidered here on the gold thread, the gold cloth. And actually, this is the only picture of a uniform or a description of a uniform that was worn at court that had anything that identified the wearer as Russian. Everything else was made according to Western European styles for men at court. So the message for men is that when you are at court, you must look thoroughly European and not have any kind of visual representation of your ethnic identity. Now, the issue for women was different, or the image of women that was supposed to be projected was different. So this is a photograph from the late 19th century, and her gown is styled in the according to the Western European styles for court dress of the late 19th century. But nevertheless, this was defined as Russian dress for women at the court. And the two elements that reveal that are, maybe you've already noted them. First, the sleeves. So first of all, note that she has bare shoulders, which would not have ever been worn by a Russian woman at court. But the sleeves are like the earlier ones that we saw in the sense that they go down well past a woman's arm, maybe not as far down to the floor. And they're also open at the seam, which allows a woman to bring her arms out. And so once again, it's a sleeve that's simply decorative, but this time the aesthetic of it comes from Russian traditional dress. The other element in court dress that is Russian is the headdress that she's wearing. This is a modified version of a kokoshnik. It's done in the same sort of style around her head, but this time notice that her hair is very visible, and she has a train on here in the back, but it's made of tulle, and of course, if she has any hair on the back of her head, anyone could see it. But nevertheless, the message that's being given to Russian aristocratic women who attend court functions is that you must wear your ethnic identity on your bodies when you're at court, while your male partners would wear European dress only. Okay, so now let's look at what people outside of the court were wearing. So this message that men must be European in dress to be taken seriously carries through the 19th century. So on the left, we have this frock coat that was a popular design in Europe in the mid 1840s and 1850s that was worn in Russia as well. And this would be worn by professionals, so lawyers, doctors, people like that, university professors. And then there was a lot of men who were required by their jobs to wear uniforms. So here we have a Russian military uniform, but at the same time, men who worked at the court, government officials, university students, they all wore uniforms and were required to do so. And all of these uniforms were done according to Western European styles. There was nothing Russian about them. But once you create, let me go back here, once you create a kind of uniform, if you will, for men in this case, that allows people who are in opposition to the government to create an alternative form of dress to indicate their unhappiness with their government and its policies. And the most famous person to do so was this gentleman, Leo Tolstoy, who is dressed as a Russian peasant. And Tolstoy increasingly became disaffected with the Russian government and more increasingly more identified with the Russian peasantry. So in his photographs and sometimes in his paintings, you'll see him dressed as a peasant. But in this photograph, anyway, let's take a closer look to see what's going on. So we can see here that he has on these rather coarse, untailored trousers tucked into his boots. Okay, so that's definitely a peasant style. He has the untrimmed beard, which was also typical, and probably a bowl cut. You can't quite see it because he's going bald at this point. Um, but the shirt tells a slightly different message. So it is worn over the pants, as a Russian peasant would do, and perhaps belted. But then take a look. He's wearing European cuffs at the end of his sleeve, and they were almost certainly buttoned. We have this seam down here, so the shirt opened in the front, and right here and here you can see that there are buttons. And then he has what I believe is a watch chain, and the watch itself is inside a pocket. Now, Russian peasant men did not wear buttons. They certainly didn't have pockets. So what I think happened is that Tolstoy went to his tailor and said to him, okay, I want a peasant-looking shirt, but I also want cuffs and pockets and the modern conveniences that European fashion provided. So even here, there's a kind of mixed message going on. And the thing that we know is that those peasants who were on Tolstoy's estates were never fooled by his outfit. They knew who he was, and he was not a Russian peasant. But nevertheless, this kind of dress was taken up by other members of certainly intellectuals and radicals in the 19th century who wanted to oppose their government. And what a perfect way to do it is to be out of uniform so that nothing can happen to you. They can't arrest you for wearing the wrong clothes, but nevertheless, you're making a political statement. Now, in the case of women of educated society, um, they rejected the idea that they should wear Russian elements on their clothing. They wanted to look European. So the gown on the right is made of Russian textiles, of Russian fabric, but the design of the gown and the design of the textile are from Europe. And the same thing could be said about this dress over here on the left, which would have been worn for an evening occasion, a ball, a trip to the theater. There's nothing here that suggests that this woman is Russian, and that's the way she wants it. Um, and the idea is that just like in Europe, these women would follow the fashions and um, try to use the money that they had and the material that they had to create this European fashion for themselves. Now, just like in Europe, there were women who were opposed to this obsession with fashion that a lot of women had. They didn't want to be a fashionista or a fashion plate, whatever term you want to use. So they designed a form of radical dress just like the men did. But in this case, it looks more like this. So this is a painting from the early 1860s, and this woman is presenting herself as a radical who rejects high fashion. So notice that she has on this very ordinary hat. She has her hair cut short, which was always a sign of a radical woman in the 19th century. And then she has on this straight, rather plain black skirt, which may have a ruffle here at the end, but no other decoration. She has on a simple white blouse that you can see here, and a very ordinary brown sweater that she's wearing belted at the waist, and this rather subdued and shawl. And so the idea is that this woman is presenting herself as somebody who is really rejecting the notion that Russian high society or Russian women should be at home, good wives and good mothers, and focus on decorating their body. These women are women want to present themselves as intelligent, using their heads and abilities that they've been given to make a change for the best for their society. But notice that unlike the men who are adopting peasant dress to represent the same kinds of issues, to provide an alternative for the male model, if it were, Russian women, whether they were feminists or just radicals, could not adopt Russian women's dress, peasant women's dress, precisely because peasant women were at the very bottom of the social scale. They were seen as illiterate, uneducated, backward. All of the worst things were represented by the figure of the Russian peasant woman. And of course, this is the opposite of how the radical women are trying to present themselves. So for them, wearing Russianness on their bodies is not an option in the way it is for men. So this is what high society and the intellectuals were up to in terms of using their dress to represent various things. But what about sort of more ordinary people? So here we have two photographs that illustrate part of the process of adopting and wearing Western clothing. So if we start with the family on the left, notice that the woman is wearing this very plain, simple skirt. It's not terribly well tailored. You can see here that it's all sort of rumpled where she's sitting. And she's wearing this European style blouse, but it too is not the best made. It's all sort of bunched up here at her shoulders, and the yoking in front is not even. So it's a Western blouse, but one that was not made by a good seamstress. And then also notice that she has no real hairstyle. She simply pulled her hair back. Her husband tells a kind of a different story. He has the bowl haircut. He also has his beard, although it's been trimmed. But notice here that he's probably wearing a rubashka. And then, like all peasant men, he has his trousers tucked into his boots. The one thing that is Western about him is this jacket, and it's made according to Western European styles. So this is a family that perhaps, we can't know for sure, had come in to the city recently from the countryside and have limited means, but nevertheless, they're trying their best to integrate themselves by wearing various forms of European clothing. Now, on the other side, this couple over here tells a different story, or a more sophisticated one, if you will, on some level. So I happen to know that this gentleman here in this picture is a plumber. So he is, if you will, an artisan, a small businessman. And if we start with his wife, notice that she is completely wearing European clothing. So she has her hair styled. She has on this lovely blouse that has this silk bow right here at the neck. And then she has these elegant sleeves that do fit her properly. And the fabric here is plaid, and fabric came to Russia from Scotland the way it did everywhere else. So this is completely of European design and probably manufacturing, although the fabric itself may have been made in Russia. Now her skirt is nicely tailored, although not completely. It doesn't sort of lie flat here, but anyway, it has a little bit of design and it fits her well. So this is a woman who is representing herself as European. And there's nothing about her that would indicate that she is Russian, just based on her clothing. Her husband, of course, tells a completely different story. His concession, if you will, to Western styles is he has a crew cut, and he's trimmed his beard, gotten rid of it, and only has a mustache. But everything else that he's wearing is of Russian style. So he's wearing a rubashka out over his trousers, and his trousers are tucked into his boots. So he represents Russianness, and she represents Europeanness, which of course is the opposite of what the court is trying to do with its uniforms, as it were. But this was very typical, actually, in 19th century Russia. The um, the Russian merchantry and small businessmen were very patriotic and were proud of their ethnic identity. So they resisted moving into wearing Western European suits until they got a lot wealthier and then would adopt Western suits like their counterparts in Europe. But that takes a longer period of time. But their wives and their daughters would be allowed to wear European clothing. And I have read this, that it was precisely so that they could find a spouse who perhaps would be of a higher station in Russian society, and so that their daughters could move up the social ladder. Anyway, this is an example of how Russian and European dress operated among ordinary people. Now, that was one thing to acquire Russian or European clothing, but quite another matter as to how to wear it. So that's what these slides represent. On the right, this couple, I happen to think that the gentleman looks like Colin Firth, but whatever. We have him wearing this beautifully tailored suit. The fabric, you can see, is well made, and the suit fits him perfectly. He has on this white starched collar, and his hair is groomed as well as his mustache. And his wife's outfit tells the same story. She has this hairstyle. It's simple but elegant, and her gown, too, is beautifully made. It fits her perfectly. And we have a couple that, if you look at them, you'll see that they are completely comfortable in this clothing that they're wearing. They have no concerns or worries about how they look. And so it's a kind of sophisticated elegance that this couple was able to achieve, presumably because they had the money to do so. Now, the couple on the right do not tell that story. They are still struggling with figuring out what to wear and how to wear it. So let's begin with the gentleman. He has a European style haircut, and he is also wearing this very formal Western suit that men would wear. But notice that it doesn't fit him very well. At the where the vest is, you can see that it's kind of very tight around his waist here. But the real problem is that the trousers come over his shoes, which of course is not something to wear out in public. But the other egregious thing about what he's wearing is this hat, which is a boater, and boaters were made of straw and made to be worn in the summer for leisure activities like boating and picnicking and strolling. You would never combine it with this very formal dress suit that this man is wearing. Now, his wife her outfit tells a slightly different story. So she's a very small woman, as you can see, and yet she has had her dressmaker make this dress that sort of wraps her in all this fabric, and there's lots of stuff going on in terms of her dress. She has layers and ruffles and lace, and then she's chosen to combine this dress with an umbrella, which was a sign of modernity, and I believe this is a watch chain here, another sign of modernity. And then this is a little bit hard to see, but she has this purse strapped over her waist where she's carrying other objects of modern life. And then she has on this very sad hat and clearly has not styled her hair in any particular way. So in her case, it seems to me what she's done is she's taken everything that she thinks represents modernity and put it on all at once. So rather than having the kind of edited elegance of this woman over here, she's wearing too much. And then her husband just really needs a better tailor and some advice on what not to wear in combination with each other. Okay, so these are the struggles that ordinary people are having and are occurring throughout the 19th century. But at a point, probably sometime in the second half of the 19th century, um, the Russian government and members of high society are becoming increasingly concerned that Russians are losing their ethnic identity. So people who live in the cities are dressing like this, and there's nothing Russian about what they wear. And so the government decides that it's going to rediscover, if you will, Russianness. And to do that, they sent scholars out to the countryside to discover what they can of Russianness and Russian culture. So what they find is something rather unexpected. So archaeologists working in southern Russia discover Scythian gold and artifacts from the Scythians. The Scythians were a group of Asian nomads who came into Russia, in southern Russia, around the time of Christ. Um, and they settled there for a while, and then they were defeated by yet another group of nomads. But they left behind these beautiful gold artifacts. They were very small, so what one of the archaeologists has done is done a sketch of the figures on the Scythian gold to show more clearly what the Scythians wore. Now, if we look at this sketch, notice that the trousers are tucked into the boots. The trousers themselves are brightly colored and have different patterns and colors on them. The men are wearing kaftans. They're shorter than the ones that I showed you earlier, in part because these are horsemen, but nevertheless, it's the same garment and it closes in the front. In the case over here, we can see that there's some kind of button and then they're belted. So these very things are precisely the elements that Russians think of as Russian. And yet here we have Scythians wearing them, and Scythians are not considered Russian, they're Asian. So this creates a conundrum then. Well, what is Russianness? If, people who lived well before the creation even of Kiev could be wearing Russian clothing, what does that say? What does that tell us? So one of the results of this was that Alexander III, when he became emperor of Russia in 1881, decided that he was going to reform the Russian military dress so that when the Russian army met its European counterparts, everybody would know they were Russian. So the result was something like this. So this gentleman is wearing what is usually called in English the army greatcoat, but it is in fact a kaftan. In this case, it's double-breasted and it has the Western European collar and epaulets, but nevertheless, it's belted at the waist. So it was an integration, if you will, of European styles and designs with uh, Russian elements. The other thing to note is this man is wearing a papacha, which isn't at all Russian. It originated in Georgia. I'm sorry, not in Georgia, in the Caucasus. Um, but nevertheless, it's an integration of this sort of more Asian style into this European uniform. Now, as cultural figures and society begin to sort of mull all of this over, um, it, Russian culture sort of divides on this question of dress and what to wear. So there is a conservative branch of thought that Russians should really add more Russian touches to their clothing. And it culminates or is publicized by a group called the Union of Russian Women that was formed in the early 20th century. And their goal for their organization was to bring old Russian beauty back into Russian life, modern Russian life, to get rid of the European influences. So this is a party that they held, I think it was in 1906. And you can see here that the women are wearing versions of old Russian peasant and aristocratic dress. The other thing to note is that the, the men, not all of them, but most of them, are wearing Western suits. So if it is, if you will, it's the recreation of court dress at the top of the social scale. And now it's being maintained by this very society. And believe it or not, these women felt so strongly about wearing Russian clothing that they would wear these garments at home and sometimes out into public. But while this is going on, there are other artists who say, nah, this isn't what we want to do. We don't want to create or really copy old Russian design. We want to create something that's new, modern, fresh, but still reflects our Russianness. So one of the groups that does this creates a ballet company, the Ballets Russes. Now their costume designer was Lev Bakst, and these are two sketches that he did for costumes for the ballet Scheherazade. And the purpose of these costumes was to liberate the dancers' bodies from any kind of constraining fabric and costume so that they could dance according to modern ballet. And this company is one of the first companies that creates the new modern ballet, which we now see to this day. So Box needed to create costumes that allowed the body to flow, were not encumbering, and this is what he came up with. And of course, one of the first things that we notice is the use of color. So on this eunuch costume, we see that this incredible rust has also blue and gold, not color combinations that one would necessarily expect together, as well as different unusual patterns. And the same thing over here. We have crescent moons and we have triangles and polka dots. And the idea is that when a dancer would put on this costume and perform on stage, um, the light and the movement would create this fascinating sort of whirl of color and pattern that was really beautiful. Now, the Ballet Russe never performed in Russia proper. They performed in Western Europe and North America. But when the first ballets went to Paris, about 1909 and 1910, the women who saw these costumes were so enthralled with them that they rushed to the Parisian designers and said, "Oh my God, we have to look like this. Please free us from our corsets and our heavy fabrics and our bustles and our elaborate hats that are hard to keep on our heads. Make us look more like this." So that is, in fact, what happened. And you have the beginning of the new modern look for women. It begins in Paris and in Western Europe. And then, in this sort of ironic twist, it comes back to Russia via Paris, these Russian inspired designs. And Russia's great fashion designer, Nadezhda Lamanova, creates these two beautiful gowns in the 1910s. Now, if we look at them, you can see it's a slim silhouette. A woman, in fact, could have worn this gown if she was slim enough, without a corset if she wanted to. And notice that what Lamanova has done is she's placed in both cases tulle as a kind of overskirt. And then on the right, with the green gown, you can see that the tulle itself is embossed with flowers and leaves and also they're all of different colors. And with the gown on the left, what she has done is she has placed these delicate lines that are made from gemstones that go all the way down the gown until you get to the gemstones here at the bottom in a horizontal line. And then she has this beautiful black velvet hem on the gown. And then she takes these same fabrics and uses them to create this really stunning bodice for this dress. And the idea of these gowns is just like with the ballet costumes, when a woman would put them on and say, go to a ball or to the theater, as she would walk, there would be the gowns would always look a little bit different depending on how the light hit them and how a woman was moving. These were very dramatic dresses, even though the women themselves were wearing less fabric than they had previously. But it's one thing to create beautiful ball gowns, but what are ordinary women going to wear? What is going to be fashionable for them? And in 1916, this is one of the suggestions that is made. So in May of 1916, in the middle of World War I, there was a fashion show in St. Petersburg. And in addition to actual outfits, students at the Design Institute were asked to present sketches of their views of what fashion should be in the future. And this is one of the sketches that they came up with. And here we have this wonderful synthesis of Russian and European inspired designs. So if we start here with the woman on the right, all the women are actually wearing these skirts, and notice that the skirts have now risen. They're no longer down to the floor. So this is the beginning of modern dress for women, precisely during World War I. And in the case of the woman on the right, she has on this floral fabric, a simple white European blouse, but then over the blouse, she's wearing this Russian garment that I showed you earlier with the straps and then this kind of over blouse or over apron, whatever you want to call it. And we can see from her sketch that she intends for this garment to be made of a different fabric from the skirt. So in other words, a lot of drama in terms of color and pattern that would make this a really beautiful garment. The woman right here on the left in the center, her coat also represents this synthesis of European and Russian design. So the coat itself is of a European style, but it has this black trim here around the neck, the shoulders, and then there's embroidery at the cuff and the hem of the coat. So this is taking traditional Russian embroidery, which is how this is to be made, and designing this elegant and beautiful coat. Finally, these two women are wearing a version of the papaja. And there's probably a couple of reasons for that, but mostly during World War I, a lot of women everywhere wore things on in their outfits that were to represent the soldiers who were fighting for them. So in this case, the designer has suggested that these women wear the papaja. We have this extraordinary integration now, and one that doesn't look like sort of fake, well, anyway, a beautiful integration of Russian and um, French design, if you will. So, what I'd like to leave you with is the idea that um, did a French corset stifle a Russian heart? No. What happened instead is precisely what Peter the Great had hoped would happen, that Russians would become full and equal partners with Europeans so that Russian designers themselves could influence French fashion or European fashion. So I will stop there and thank you very much.
Given that 18th or 19th century Russian aristocracy were French speaking, do you see more influence from French fashion than, say, English? Or is general European fashion represented pretty evenly as an influence?
Well, that's a great question. And I would answer it by saying that it was Paris that was really the heart of the fashion industry for women. However, for men, it tended to be England and London with the English tailoring for the suits. And they had a really profound impact on men's dress in the end. But both places kind of come to represent what is meant by European clothing for Russians.
Mm-hmm. And there is also a question about Nicholas II. Agnes notes that he dressed quite simply for every day. She asks if he wore rubashka, but I would probably also broaden this question and just ask you to describe what the last Russian Tsar wore in his family, what was their fashion. As far as I understand, at some point they got obsessed with this a la Russe fashion, but was there anything else?
Well, I think they wore a variety of fashions. I don't think it was any one particular form of dress. If anything, Nicholas II tended to wear military uniforms. He preferred that, and indeed, a lot of monarchs by the 20th century in Europe tended to wear military dress. Um, but so there are, I think, a few pictures of Nicholas wearing a rubashka, but it's not the peasant one, it's the military one. So underneath the greatcoats for ordinary soldiers, they would wear a type of rubashka, no embroidery or anything like that. The women in the pictures that I've seen have tended to wear European fashion alone. But that's not to say that some women at court and even in high society adopted sort of like Russian lace that they would wear with their European costumes. Um, so it's an attempt to, once again, provide this synthesis. But for the most part, they tended to wear European dress and fashionable European dress at the same time. That's pretty much all I'm able to say at this point. Never
Mhm.
really studied their outfits that much, but of the pictures that they have, that's what I've noticed.
Yeah, but there was this ball that you mentioned, I believe it was 1903, where
Ah,
this
yes. Ah,
new
yes.
fashion, yeah. Yeah,
Okay,
which we
so
have it
let me
correctly.
talk about the ball because that is an important moment. So the first pictures that I showed you of Muscovites uh, were costumes that were designed for this 1903 ball, which was intended to celebrate the Peter the Great's ascension to the throne and all of his accomplishments. Well, Nicholas II was not a fan of Peter the Great, so he decided it was going to be a celebration of Muscovite culture. And the irony of it all is that um, so they decided to have this ball, and everybody was supposed to come dressed as a Muscovite. So what does high society do? But it gets the very same fashion designers like Lev Bakst and the other people who are doing modern fashion and asks them to recreate these costumes from Muscovy. So they're reproductions of what they thought would have looked Muscovites would have worn. As I understand it, the only people who wore genuine clothing were Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna. They wore gowns that were worn by Alexis Mikhailovich and his one of his wives. So this supposed celebration of Peter's, dramatic reforms and Europeanization is undercut by this ball and its emphasis on Russianness before Peter and Russian culture before Peter. And it shows you the way in which Russian society itself is kind of divided on which way Russia should go.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's also a great question from Douglas. Well, actually, Douglas's wife. She wants to ask if there was a large embroidery industry at the heart of these clothing traditions. And Bianca actually responded, look up Kitmir. Kitmir was founded in Paris, but what about Moscow and St. Petersburg?
Yes, there is a very long tradition of embroidery in the area of the Russian Empire. And it starts, as you could see, with Russian women's peasant dress itself. And it continues all the way through. Actually, Professor Wendy Salmond has written a really interesting book about embroidery in Russia and how it becomes popularized in the 19th century by the elite. And they set up workshops to try to find these old designs and teach women how to do them. At the same time, embroidery is used on lots of things. And then this industry actually moves to Western Europe, where it becomes very popular among European women. So that again, we have this sort of fascinating cross-fertilization that not just just doesn't just go from um, Paris to Petersburg, but the other way. And there were shops in London where you could buy Russian embroidery in the 1920s. So it's a fascinating story. And there are some women now who are working on writing sort of scholarly approaches to this. So,
Hmm. Do we have any specific fashion icons in the early 20th century Russia? Women who set trends or inspired through their clothing, etc. It's the question from Bianca.
uh, you mean fashion icons?
Yeah, fashion icons, maybe specific women who set the trends besides the royal family.
Okay. I know a lot less about this, but I can tell you this, that women of the theater were enormously influential um, in wearing new fashion. The Ballet Russe ballerinas also publicized European fashion when when they were becoming famous as dancers. Any woman who was in the public spotlight, but primarily in these sort of cultural enterprises, became a kind of fashion plate and inspired other women to do so. Um, that's really all I'll say about that. But if you look at any books on Russian film or Russian theater, look at the women whose photographs are there, and you'll see how they were doing this. And what would happen is that they would come to the ateliers in Petersburg, so they would publicize the designers who they liked, just like what happens in nowadays, and and then other women would go to the same atelier and the same designer, and this was a way in which they could publicize modern fashion in Russia.
Hmm. And in your presentation, you discussed Russian fashion up until the Russian Revolution of 1917. And
Yeah.
there is another great question: What happened next? How did the Russian fashion industry survive the revolution? And what is the state of Russian fashion today?
Okay, a complicated question. What happened to Russian fashion is in World War One, it was as if the Russian government had declared war on the fashion industry. A lot of the people who were involved were Germans and Austrians, and so the government set about to shut down their industries, and it was a way in which fashion could no longer be made. And then, in addition to that, there was a kind of public attack on fashion, that women were spending too much money and they were neglecting their husbands and their children. I mean, there's this whole discourse on how evil fashion is. And because fabric is disappearing, whatever fabric was being made was being used for military uniforms. The tailors were sent off to the army. I mean, it's literally a collapse of the Russian fashion industry by the revolution of 1917. And what happens after that is I think incredibly ironic. So there is no place to get clothing made in revolutionary Russia, say Russia from 1917 to 1922, because the destruction was so intense. Um, if you could find fabric, you might be able to find someone who could make you a dress, or you could try to make one yourself. But curiously, what tends to happen, because people do need clothing, is they tend to use the old clothes to make new ones for themselves. And so I know of instances where curtains from um, elaborate apartments were used to make new clothing. In other cases, men would tailor, Western suits to wear, to fit themselves. So it's a way, an odd way in which the clothing that has been so discredited by the revolution is resurrected because people have to have something to wear. And it's only in the mid 1920s that a fashion industry begins to reemerge again. And some of you may know this, but Russia's women revolutionary artists who were advocates of the revolution became clothing designers and came up with this new avant-garde look, which has been well popularized and is very beautiful. But it's done in this modern style, and it is a rejection of Parisian fashion in that sense, although they don't go back to wearing long kaftans and things like that. So, if you look at any books on Russian avant-garde art from the 1920s, you will typically see examples of what happened in terms of fabric design and even some of the designs of the dresses that were made. But it does take a long time for the fashion industry to emerge again. And in terms of Russian fashion today, um, what I would say is this, that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have the emergence of a fashion industry once more. There had always been one in the Soviet Union, but it was restricted in various ways that it's way too complicated to talk about in this talk. But once you get to the 1990s and Russians have more access to fashion in the West, and now it's not just in Paris, but everywhere else, they train a whole new group of designers. And the real issue is how they can acquire the amount of fabric that they would need. But by the late 1990s, you have Russian designers who are very influential in the West in creating clothing that lots of people want to wear. So it does come back full force. And what's happening now, I simply can't say. I don't have any information about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel like that'd be nice to probably have another talk on the 20th century Russian fashion. I feel like it's a totally different story. So,
Absolutely.
our audience, if you're interested, please email me. You all have my contacts. If you want that, we can make it happen next year. So, yeah,
I
I'm
actually
looking
have
forward
a
for your
I
feedback.
actually know a couple people who've written about it, so I can give you some names of people to contact.
Perfect. Yeah, and Dr. Rian, the last question I will ask you, I'll stop sharing actually. Can you see me?
Yes, I
Yeah,
can.
perfect. So this question is of my own. Last week it was my birthday, and I received this very interesting present from one of my friends who likes thrifting. So she gave me this Russian Barbie. It's
Ah,
special edition. It's collector edition of Barbies from different countries, and this one is from like it was made right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They also made
yeah.
some French, Puerto Rican Barbies and everything. So
Mm-hmm.
if you look at this Barbie, could you technically potentially identify what style it can be? Is it just Muscovite style, or it's kind of a mixture of everything? Because I can see the kokoshnik as this shirt.
Right.
What is this?
Well, this is once again an amalgam of West and East, or West and Russian. So you're right, it is a kokoshnik. The blouse, however, is not in a style. That's not the way Russian peasant women would have worn a dress, um, or even elite women. We saw how the sleeves made those outfits very different. But she is wearing this um, over blouse that is typical of Russian dress, female dress. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the Russian name for it. Um, and then the skirt. I don't really recognize. Yeah, that's
There's
again,
some ornaments. Yeah.
yeah, it's a sort of European vision or imagination of what a Russian peasant woman would have worn, or maybe a Russian Barbie would have worn,
Hmm.
because it's short, right? So, but there
Yeah.
is the embroidery on it to make it look Russian. So
Mhm.
that would be how I would analyze it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.